大家好，同志们. Welcome back to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast with your host, Drew Smith. As always, it's good to be back in the studio. Kind of had a crazy March. Pretty much everything after International Working Women's Day in my life became a total roller coaster, but honestly, the less said about that, the better. For real, though, you guys don't want to even hear about it. Actually, there is some good news. Ching Ching, our podcast's fluffy feline mascot, is doing much better now. He's home from the hospital, and he's doing very well and is very receptive to his medications. And my partner Yukun and I have booked our hotel for a 7-day romantic getaway to Beijing in July. This is going to be my third time going to Beijing. Actually, but Beijing's just one of those cities you want to go back to multiple times because there's just so much to see and do there, Centuries of history there for the taking, and it's such a great global city. I actually like it a lot better than Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, which are cool cities, but Beijing, when it comes to the tier 1 cities, Beijing is the star of my heart. And the good thing is we'll be staying near the 798 Art District, too, which is actually a really cool spot where they converted a bunch of 1950s era factories that the East Germans built for the Chinese. And now it's a bunch of art galleries and restaurants. Also, I'll be getting to meet her extended family for the first time, so fingers crossed on that. Also, I'm really excited to finally be getting to see the World War II Museum in Beijing, which I miss each time I go, so I'll report back to you guys about that during our summer episodes. Also, it's Qingming Festival, or Tomb Sweeping Festival, this upcoming week, and that's when, in Chinese culture, everyone goes back home to clean up and leave offerings at the graves and tombs of their ancestors. So I think I'm getting about 6 days off so I can just be here and kick back and decompress. Anyways, let's get back to the story and what was all going on. Last episode, we had a very special roundtable discussion about the Shanghai Commune and the brief commune movement that took over the January storm across February, but was superseded by the revolutionary committees, the 3-in-1 legislative bodies, first founded in Heilongjiang, that were to be made up of 1/3 rebel party members, 1/3 rebel mass organizations, and 1/3 PLA officers. However, a few other things happened during February outside of Shanghai, Harbin, and Beijing that I think you guys need to know about before we dive into what happened in March of '67. When we start to see that the January storm begins to fracture and the People's Liberation Army finally becomes a major player in the story of the Cultural Revolution. Okay, so while things were going down in Shanghai, and after Heilongjiang, Shanghai, Shandong, and Guizhou established their provincial and municipal revolutionary committees, in Beijing, the Red Guard movement was trying to figure out where to go from the main wave of power seizures, and the rest of the country was beginning to find itself descending into factional fighting, not unlike those seen in the previous months on the university campuses. Yeah, now it was spreading to the provinces, into the countryside. During the first week of February, the Red Guards of Beijing surrounded the Soviet embassy and laid siege to it, making it difficult for embassy staff to enter or exit without being pelted with rocks, bottles, and little red books. One thing I forgot to tell you guys about on this podcast, although I wrote about it in my book, Which East is Red, Foreign Languages Press 2019. You can buy it on their website. It's pretty awesome and it's cheap. Was on 25th of January 1967, a group of 65 Chinese students studying abroad in Moscow, as well as some Chinese embassy employees, started an anti-revisionist demonstration in Red Square, shouting quotations from Chairman Mao's Little Red Book inside Lenin's mausoleum and around the square, which led to dozens of Chinese being brutally beaten and severely injured by the Moscow police. This led to the Red Guards in Beijing swarming the Soviet embassy in China, vowing revenge for the attack on their comrades. At one point, according to the sources that I read for my book when I was writing it, up to 1 million people were demonstrating outside the Soviet embassy each night. To the youth of Beijing, it was a chance to be literally on the front lines of the battle against Soviet social imperialism. And Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi joined in the demonstration on February 11th. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, a big debate was breaking out. Was it time for the PLA to be exposed to the Cultural Revolution? After all, the PLA had been the epicenter of the socialist education movement, which had been the prelude, or as I called it back in episode 1, the beta test of the Cultural Revolution. The People's Liberation Army was also where the Little Red Book that had become, the manual of the Cultural Revolution originated. So why was the PLA still sitting on the sidelines of the biggest shakeup in the Chinese 20th century? Why did, to quote Howard Zinn, the PLA insist on staying neutral on a moving train? Well, with such questions looming over them, the Central Military Commission of the PLA, or I'll call it the CMC at times, and the Politburo of the Communist Party decided to hold a series of joint meetings in early February about the matter. Although Mao himself was noticeably absent for some reason. Foreign Minister Chen Yi, a longtime army strongman before he went into foreign affairs, voiced his opposition, saying that unleashing the Cultural Revolution into the army would end up having the opposite effect and allow the rightists to overthrow the socialist state because the army would be unable to stop them. Marshal Ye Jiayang angrily opposed, screaming loudly at Chen Boda, Lin Biao, and other CCRG officials, "You've messed up the party, you've messed up the government, now you want to mess up the army too?" In fact, Marshal Ye was so mad that he slammed the table so hard that he broke his hand while screaming in Lin Biao and Chen Boda's faces. Marshal Xu Shangqian chimed in, yelling just as loudly, "Oh, why don't you just have Kwai Du-fu chair the army? Or do you idiots not even want to have an army at all?" Well, obviously, many of the PLA's officer corps thought that bringing the Cultural Revolution into the army would cause the destruction of the army and, according to them, the destruction of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Only Kang Sheng outright stood up to the tirade of the general, saying, "The army does not belong only to you, Comrade Xu." But in the end, the meeting did conclude that it was time for the PLA to step up to the plate and join in the Cultural Revolution. It also agreed that the Politburo and the Central Military Commission would make sure that there would be a ban on Red Guards and rebel workers from setting up nationwide mass organizations, because doing so might be tantamount to creating a second political party. Mao had warned earlier in his critique of the Shanghai Commune that nationwide mass Red Guard groups might lead to extreme anarchisms, and that rebels should be careful in how they should decide to run things after the power seizures. That same week, Red Guards began putting up dazebals accusing Vice Premier Tan Zhenlin, one of the PLA marshals who was against the idea of expanding the Cultural Revolution into the army, of attempting to organize a February countercurrent. Tan Zhenlin had initially supported the idea of the Cultural Revolution when it was launched in May of '66, but he became resolutely opposed to the creation of the Central Cultural Revolution group. And that was very that's the key difference with him. But eventually he became one of the rare vocal opponents of the Cultural Revolution entirely, especially after the January storm. Red Guard leader Tan Huolan, no relation to Tan Zhenlin, organized a mass rally of various Red Guard factions calling for a beating back of the February countercurrent of capitalist restoration led by Tan Zhenlin. Slogans even included, "Death to Vice Premier Tan for betraying Chairman Mao." Yikes. On February 22nd, the various Red Guard HQs, you remember how they had the first Red Guard HQ, the second Red Guard HQ, the third Red Guard HQ, across Beijing were consolidated into a single Red Guard Congress headed by Nian Wanze, Kuai Dufu, and Tan Huolan, with Jiang Qing and Zhou Enlai backing the creation of the new Congress. 10,000 Red Guard leaders from around Beijing attended the meeting at the Great Hall of the People and hoped to put aside their differences. The next day, the declaration of the Congress of the Red Guards of Beijing was broadcast nationally on all radio stations, hoping to inspire other Red Guard groups in other parts of the country to join in similar local congresses and put aside the factionalism that was beginning to spread across every corner of China. Such attempts were certainly necessary, I must say. Across the month, many power seizures in places like Fuzhou, Sichuan, and Qinghai fell apart immediately, with Red Guards breaking into open fighting with each other, with local PLA garrisons, or with rightist party cadres who were attempting to, in a manner similar to the Nanjing Jiangsu incident I told you guys about last month, wrangle control of the parallel seizures. Particularly dramatic was on February 23rd when in Xining, the remote capital of Qinghai province, local Red Guards tried to seize power and began cobbling together a revolutionary committee. Tragically, the local PLA leader, General Zhao Yongfu, opposed the power seizure and led PLA troops opening fire on the local rebels who had established their headquarters temporarily in the Qinghai Daily newspaper offices. At the end of the bombardment of the Qinghai Daily, hundreds had been killed and 10,000 Red Guards and rebel cadres were arrested across the city. And General Zhao took over the city in his own so-called, quote, revolutionary power seizure. Obviously, things were getting even messier than they had ever been, even in the most chaotic months of 1966. You thought Red August was crazy? You thought the Destroy the Old World campaign of September through December was crazy? Oh, my friends, it's about to get wild. You see, the January storm had consolidated around the Revolutionary Committee method of governance in some ways, but in other ways there was still a great deal of brutal struggle as to what direction each city, county, or province should take in building the new power. Okay, so now I've brought you guys up to speed with what happened across February, and now I bring you to March, where Mao and the party center had to make some very big decisions, or else the gains of the January storm were going to be lost to either anarchistic ultra-left chaos or far-right nationalistic warlordism. One of the first things the party center did was to issue a statement calling for the rebels to not be too eager in overthrowing every single party cadre. On March 1st, in Red Flag and in People's Daily, the Central Committee issued an editorial called "Cadres Must Be Treated Correctly," which, in detail, explained how to tell the difference between capitalist rotor cadres and revolutionary rebel cadres, and how to try to use line struggle to win intermediate or vacillating party cadres over to a revolutionary line first, before resorting to struggle sessions or other violent means, and to attempt to mobilize the rebel cadres to aid in the construction of the revolutionary committees and other new forms of mass power. A couple of days later, the bombarding of certain sections of the PLA would continue, with Jiang Qing declaring that the PLA garrison in Beijing had supported the United Action Red Guards. Gasp! A very grave accusation that insinuated that the PLA in the capital itself had been part and parcel to the rightists' attempt to suppress the rebel movement in the city and were in need of line struggle just like the rest of society. It was time, many in Beijing felt, to unleash PLA rank-and-file soldiers and to begin struggling against their officers who may have had connection to the United Action Red Guards, the work teams, the Picket Corps, and other such right-wing groups. Meanwhile, in Heilongjiang, where the first revolutionary committee was formed in late January, PLA officers felt that the left was still weak within the province, and that the rebel cadres and Red Guards that helped them make up the Revolutionary Committee were still susceptible to being knocked back down by the old guard, and proclaimed that the army should take the lead of the Revolutionary Committee there so as to, quote, support the left, as the party center had begun ordering PLA units to do. As you guys will see, however, this begins a series of events that ends up eventually making the PLA the dominant force in nearly every provincial and municipal revolutionary committee, which was sometimes a good thing, especially because, well, at that point, the PLA was the only nationwide state apparatus still fully functioning, and sometimes it was a bad thing. But, well, more on that later. It was then that the PLA was sent into the realm of educations. While the universities were to remain closed so that college students could continue taking part in class struggle, the party decided it was time to get K through 12 schools back in session. After all, students hadn't attended school since mid-June, and I guess they felt that for now there was really only so much more that literal kids could do in the struggle against the capitalist rotors. The People's Daily issued a call on March 7th that said, "Primary and secondary schools, reopen classes and make revolution." And it essentially argued kind of a line of, grasp revolution, promote production, but grasp revolution, get an education. The army was sent into high schools all across the nation and rounded up the youngins and got them back in their desk seats. And also used the period to conduct military training among the youth in case of American imperialist or Soviet socialist imperialist invasion, as well as to continue ideological and theoretical instruction to the students and to their teachers. According to party orders, the PLA was to instruct K through 12 students to, quote, overcome their tendencies of departmentalism, small group mentality, ultra-democracy, individualism, and anarchism, and instill discipline through mock military drills. And, this is particularly interesting to me because even to this day, every school year in middle school and high school here in China, they begin with military drills for the kids. Now, these days, it's just as the headmaster of one of the schools I worked for said, instill patriotic spirit and camaraderie among the classmates. But in fact, the practice does have revolutionary origins, and there still is a slight undertone that teenagers are supposed to be the reserve force in case of an actual land invasion of China by an imperialist force. But I digress. I just think it's really interesting because here we see the convergence of the PLA and the high school Red Guard movements coming together to work together and learn from each other, meaning that both sections of society, the youth and the military, were entering a new stage of the Cultural Revolution. Furthermore, the State Council put forward a new directive. Because it was now springtime, there were to be absolutely no more power seizures in the rural areas until spring and summer farm work was over. The peasant rebels were told that they had sufficiently grasped revolution for now, but at least for a couple of months, it was time to promote production. In some areas, the PLA was sent in to make sure planting and sowing of crops went forward properly, and many soldiers were ordered to take part in farm work so as to properly serve the people and transform the PLA back into the People's Army that it was originally established to be. This directive of serve the people and support the left would later be expanded, and in the month of March and into April, PLA units were sent to factories and workplaces to have soldiers take part in production alongside rebel workers. Back in Beijing, things were, they were wild as ever. General Zhao Yongfu, the perpetrator of the Xining massacre, was actually brought to Beijing as a consultant on how to suppress counter-revolutionaries and the bourgeois reactionary line. Red Guard demonstrations against Tan Zhanlin and the February countercurrent continued, calling not only for his toppling but for his outright execution. Lin Biao called upon Admiral Li Zuopeng, the deputy commander of the PLA Navy, to start collecting the name of possible capitalist rotors within the Naval Officer Corps and to prepare for class struggle within the Navy. On 9th of March, Mao sat down with the Beijing Municipal Party Committee and various Red Guard groups and began to lay down plans for a Beijing Revolutionary Committee, though he felt that it would be better to wait for late March or early April to actually found it. See, the thing is, Mao had other problems to deal with. Mao was concerned about General Zhao's massacre of rebels in Shanghai and asked for a military inquiry on the matter. However, at that point, the Central Military Commission ended up commending General Zhao, telling him what he did was fine, and that he had in fact prevented a group of rightist rebels and rightist cadres from pulling off a Nanjing-style phony power seizure. A total brah moment for the CMC. And it was a sign that the upper echelons of the army were still not fully behind the power seizures, as they had been carried out during the January storm. Mao was elated, though, to hear that elsewhere in the provinces, the Cultural Revolution wasn't entirely doom and gloom. In Taiyuan, the Shanxi Provincial Revolutionary Committee was established on March 18th. No, not our Shanxi, the other Shanxi. It's a slightly subtle difference of sound in Chinese. I haven't quite mastered the different tones of Shanxi and Shanxi right now. But yeah, anyways, the Shanxi Provincial Revolutionary Committee had consolidated rebel power all around the rather rural and isolated but strategically important province. It's honestly pretty impressive because I've been to Shanxi, and yeah, it's pretty country out there. So the fact that they were one of the earliest revolutionary committees is kind of interesting to me. The Shanxi Revolutionary Rebel Headquarters, a coalition of all the Red Guards and rebel worker trade unions in the province that seized power during the January Storm, had decided to follow Beijing's orders to build new power via revolutionary committee rather than through a commune. The rebel HQ declared, quote, "The power of the province, capital city, and the counties are still at risk of being stolen by a small group of people in power who take the capitalist road in the party. Thus, we must strive to regain rebel power before the end of March." The rebel HQ requested that the army be brought in to help them to prevent the capitalist roaders from rolling back the power seizure. And together they formed the new Revolutionary Committee, electing Liu Geping as the chairman of the Shanxi Provincial Revolutionary Committee. Now, Liu was an interesting choice in my mind because he was a Hui Muslim who had been head of the United Front in the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region for several years. And if I recall, he was part of the quote, Muslim Red Army detachments in the Ningxia, Shanxi, Gansu region during the Yan'an period. But he had only been recently transferred to Shanxi as vice governor a year before. So, I mean, it's just interesting how this Hui guy came from left field to establish one of the earliest revolutionary committees. Anyways, back to Beijing. In Beijing, the struggle around the February countercurrent continued to sharpen. Suddenly, pro-Tan Zhonglin posters began being posted up around town, declaring that the attack on Tan was in fact not an attack on the February countercurrent, but was secretly an indirect attack on Premier Zhou Enlai. However, whoever was putting up these posters was certainly in the minority. On March 13th, 100,000 people marched on Tiananmen Square, calling for Chen Yi and Tan Zhonglin to be toppled, and that vengeance against the February countercurrent be carried out by any means necessary. In fact, the struggle got so sharp that Deng Xiaoping's brother, who was a Guizhou province local bureaucrat and supporter of the February countercurrent, committed suicide on March 15th. On March 17th in Wuhan, General Chen Zhaidao had several agitators within the local PLA arrested, fearing that local units would start fracturing into rebel groups. Here in Xi'an, a group of ethnically Hui Red Guards called the Shanxi Muslim Revolutionary Rebels Headquarters had set themselves up. The Shanxi Provincial PLA expressed concern that the group would threaten working-class unity and would be engaged in what Lenin called Bundism, or, I guess maybe what in today's lingo we might call identity politics. But you guys know what I mean. And so the Shanxi PLA complained to the CCRG in Beijing about the Shanxi Muslim Revolutionary Rebels HQ. Indeed, Mao would eventually agree 2 weeks later to banning all ethnic-based rebel groups. Oddly enough, though, a friend of mine's grandma was in the Shanxi Revolutionary Rebels HQ when she was young, but sadly, and I don't blame her, she has declined my offer to an interview here on the podcast. A very nice old lady, though, has told me a few very neat things about her life as a Hui person during the GPCR. Meanwhile, the CCRG was trying to get the PLA involved in the struggle. While the CCRG was trying to get the PLA involved in the struggle, one branch of government was, in fact, inoculated from line struggle. The Central Intelligence Department, or what is known today as the Ministry of State Security. The rationale was that state secrets and the ability to protect China from international espionage would be compromised if rebel factions arose from within the CID. So Kang Sheng and Zhou Enlai gave the go-ahead to freeze the Cultural Revolution within all secret police, foreign intelligence, and counter-espionage agencies. Which, I mean, it makes sense, although it does bring up the question. I wanna ask this. Can any part of a state be free of cultural revolution under socialism? I don't know. Let me know what you guys think on our official Twitter account or in our Discord server. I'm sure that could actually generate some interesting discussion. On March 19th, the Central Military Commission met with Lin Biao chairing the meeting and issued a new doctrine for the PLA, the quote, 3 supports and 2 militaries. The 3+2 formula meant 1, support the left, 2, support the workers, and 3, support the peasants. And 1, fulfill military training, and 2, enforce military control. Lin Biao's speech proclaimed that the Cultural Revolution's gains had been great, and that the excesses and errors had been tiny. But now that intense two-line struggle against the capitalist roaders in the party had sharpened even further, and now it was time for the army to advance to the front lines of the class struggle. Now, this put the army in an interesting conundrum. They were being told to support the left, but who was the left? The problem is everyone claimed to be left. Even Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping claimed to be part of the left. Tang Zhanlin claimed to be part of the left. I mean, nobody wanted to be a centrist or a rightist during the Cultural Revolution, right? So thus came the question, which factions were they going to support and how? Well, let's just say a lot of different people had a lot of different ideas in the PLA on who was the left and how to support it, and it was going to have some serious consequences all around the country, as you guys will see in upcoming episodes. Regardless, the CMC meeting on the 19th had far-reaching effects. The party declared that a person's attitude towards the PLA determines whether he is a revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary. Xiao Hua, head of the PLA's General Political Department, announced plans to convene a all-army study congress later in the year so as to sharpen the political acumen of every soldier in the army. On the 22nd, Mao told Zhou Enlai and Lin Biao to allow the PLA to have complete control over the Central Intelligence Department, meaning that now the armed forces were in control of all state secrets and international counterintelligence/espionage. No small amount of state power, if I may say. Oh, hey, remember that General Zhao guy I talked about earlier? The guy who, in Shanghai, he massacred all those Red Guards and rebel workers, and then was called to Beijing to become a consultant in suppressing rightists? Well, Mao called once again for the CMC to hold a second inquiry into the Xining massacre, and within a few days, justice was served. General Zhao was found guilty of crimes against the people and was jailed, with his subordinate Liu Shanchuan taking over Qinghai province and proclaiming that he would now, quote, support the left. As for the Red Guard movement in Beijing, another major development happened on March 25th. When the Congress of Middle School Red Guards was formed under the auspices of Jiang Qing and Zhou Enlai. Just a quick reminder, guys. The term middle school in China actually means high school. What we call middle school in the USA is called junior middle school in China. So we're actually, even though it was called the Congress of Middle School Red Guards, we're actually talking about high school students. So, 10,000 teenagers packed the Great Hall of the People and swore that their respective high schools' factions would now work together rather than continue to engage in needless factionalism and vigilante justice. Jiang Qing told the kids that it was now time to return to class and resume their studies, just like the PLA said. Although now, she said, they were armed with the science of Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and had dipped their hands in the blood of the enemy. Considering the high school Red Guards had been the most brutal and excessive of the Red Guard movement in Beijing, the party center believed that having all the under-18 Red Guards come together as a unified bloc and resume their studies would mean that their revolutionary energy could possibly be channeled into more productive conduits. Finally, the month of March wrapped up with a new cultural campaign that sort of echoed the whole debacle of Hai Rui, dismissed from office. You know, that play that triggered this whole thing going in the first place. So, I'm getting a lot of this information from the April 7th, 1967 issue of Peking Review, so it might be more than a little biased towards the party's view of things, but basically here's how March of 1967 ended in China. Okay, so in 1948, there was a movie released called Inside Story of the Qing Court. It was a Hong Kong production about the Boxer Rebellion. It was highly lambasted by Chinese communists as simultaneously glamorizing the Qing dynasty as well as advocating liberal social change and, quote, capitulation to reformism. The thing is, upon its release, Liu Shaoqi had praised it as a, quote, patriotic film for its showing of the Qing dynasty and the Boxers as being resistant to foreign colonialism. Mao kept a little note of Liu's approval of the movie, and almost 20 years later, after the glowing review, Mao and Jiang Qing used it as leverage to unleash a new wave of criticism against Liu. Mao consulted Qi Benyu, a CCRG member who was one of the main editors of Red Flag and was considered one of the most hard-line, ultra-left members of the party center, and asked him to write a criticism of the film. On March 31st, Chen Benyu read his criticism of the film, edited by Mao, over Chinese Central Radio and on Radio Peking. It mentioned, with now directly naming the person, that it was a film very much beloved by, quote, the biggest person in the party and in authority taking the capitalist road, and that the anonymous person involved was nothing more than a Khrushchevite. To everyone in China, it was very obvious who Qi was talking about, and that it was a call for further unity among all factions and state institutions in working together to bring Liu down by any means necessary. Speaking of unity among all factions, I'd like to wrap up this evening's podcast by talking about just that, the unity among all factions. What's interesting about this point in the Cultural Revolution, if you read a lot of the documents that are coming, that were in Peking Review or were being published by foreign language press or from a lot of the Wan Sui Red Guard journals, you begin to see a lot of talk of, quote, grand alliances between all revolutionary factions in overthrowing the handful of capitalist roaders within the party. And I kind of want to throw around an idea here, a preliminary idea to generate some discussion. I was talking to an old comrade of mine from my RCP days, and we were thinking about what Mao's endgame was. About, the Cultural Revolution in general, of course, but also particularly in the months following the end of the January storm. We both wonder, and we want to hear what you guys think, if Mao essentially using the whole upsurges of, he was using the whole upsurges of 1967 to identify, train, and empower a new generation of a vanguard, out of the most advanced sections of the masses with the best of the old guard from the party and army. But I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm kind of undecided myself. I think I'm partial to this theory, but I'm still, we still got a long way to go in this podcast. So once again, you guys can always sound off on the official Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast Twitter account or in our GPCR podcast Discord server. So let's put a bookmark in our story there before we reach April and May of 1967, when, despite the PLA stepping in to maintain order, China begins to slowly but surely descend into essentially a civil war of epic proportions. So, to be continued. This month's sources include Evaluating the Cultural Revolution in China and Its Legacy for the Future by the Marxist-Leninist Maoist Revolutionary Study Group. The Cultural Revolution, 1967 in Review by Ezra F. Vogel. Military Forces in the Cultural Revolution by Harvey Nelson. The Cultural Revolution in China by James Wong. The History of the Communist Party of China in Shanxi, Volume 2, 1948 to 1978. Edited by the Communist Party of China History Publishing House. The Policy of Military Supporting the Left and the Spread of Factional Warfare in China's Countryside, Shanxi, 1967 to 1968 by Shinichi Tanigawa. The Marxist Internet Archive's Peking Review Archives. Mao's Cultural Revolution in 1967, The Struggle to Seize Power by Philip Bridgham, and The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Cultural Revolution by Yang Jishang. Well, folks, let's see. No corrections corner tonight, I think. Yeah, we're good. We're good for now. But next month is going to be interesting because I'm going to start changing the format of the show. From now on, we're going to alternate between thematic episodes and narrative chronicle episodes. So, let's say maybe episode X will be the story of 2 months worth of action with my personal analysis, like tonight's episode. And then episode Y, the next episode, will be talking about things like food, music, film and literature, national minorities, gender, stuff like that. In fact, next month's episode is going to get a little steamy, because we're going to be talking about sex and sexuality during the Cultural Revolution, baby. So listener discretion advised. Giggity, giggity, giggity. No, seriously though, it's actually going to be a really interesting episode, and I'll make sure to have the People's Horny Militia on standby to bonk me to make sure that I keep it tasteful and respectful. Okay, well, it's 7:19 p.m. now here in Xi'an, so maybe I'm going to hit the snack street outside my house and get some local delicacies. It's Friday night, and all the students and faculty of Northwest University are hungry and ready to hit the town. And I think I'm going to hit the gym with my buddies after I get some snacks. Gotta stay swole for the swoletariat, you feel me? So, from the ancient city of Chang'an, I bid you a big-hearted Wan-an Zaijian. Peace out, y'all.